the Google Pixel 5a. All right. The Google Pixel 5a is a classic mid-ranger. It is not designed to be some kind of flagship. It's really not. It does have some flagship-like performance in some instances and some applications. Honestly, I would say that the software experience, the UI, the layout, you know, it's a really, because I have the Google Pixel 5. The 5a is very similar when you look at the specs and the performance and all that. So I know how the 5a is going to perform. In most cases, I think I do. There might be some nuances there. I don't know. I'll have to test it and see. But I think some people are losing track of what the Google Pixel 5a represents. It represents the pinnacle of mid-range hardware for Android. And David, we'll talk about that tier on Patreon soon. The phone itself, the Pixel 5a, is going to be probably the best option for a sub 500 phone, probably this year and then next year as well, if you think about it, because next year it'll be a little bit cheaper. It's future-proofed in that it has all of the cellular bands, LTE and 5G for the most part, with the exception of millimeter wave. Now, I was pretty bummed out when I saw that originally the report was that it had millimeter wave, and then we later found out that it doesn't support millimeter wave. I'm not sure if it's hardware definitively or if it's carriers just aren't enabling it for whatever reason. To me, initially I thought it was carriers disabling it. I think we later found out it looks more like a hardware restriction and that it's been omitted. So it got me to thinking, how many people out there bought the Google Pixel 5a for the millimeter wave access? Are there any people out there that were like, man, I'm getting this phone, it's got millimeter wave? There probably aren't many of those people, and I think it's because of that reason that Google probably omitted it to really bring the cost savings to the phone. When you sell a mid-range phone, you're not trying to make it a flagship. You're trying to fit it into a smartphone experience for a user who doesn't want to spend $700, $800, $900, $1,000 or more. They're trying to keep the cost down. Do I think there should be a version of the Google Pixel 5a with millimeter wave? You could make that argument, but it would probably be a Verizon exclusive, like what we saw last year with the 5 and the 4a 5G, and then the 4a 5G had that unique color to Verizon, and that one was the only one with millimeter wave. The other models only had, you know, the sub 6 gigahertz. So I don't think this is make or break for the phone. I think a lot of people who are looking at this phone are content having this phone without millimeter wave. If you are hell-bent on getting a Google Pixel mid-range-ish phone with millimeter wave, you should be looking at the 5. You can save some money compared to last year's pricing. I think in a lot of instances you can get a good deal on it. You can even buy it secondhand and save a ton of money. That phone is more flagship than the 5a anyway. The build quality a little bit, the wireless charging. I think the IP rating might be a little higher. I think it's IP68 as opposed to the 5a, which is IP67. The 7 and the 8 represent water ingress. I think the 6 represents dust proofing. So, you know, it has its advantages. And maybe we just need to be a little bit realistic about the expectations of a mid-range in that price point. Maybe it doesn't really need millimeter wave. Maybe there's not even much millimeter wave around you in your market. Now, for me, I'd be a little bit disappointed, a little bit, but I have a 5. And I'm going to get a 6 or a 6 Pro. If Google is nice enough to send out the 6 or the 6 Pro, I'm terribly excited to test it on the networks, and I love Google phones. Before Google started sending me phones, I was buying them. And I was reviewing them, and I was using them in testing. Right? I've always loved the user experience of the Google phones. I've had all the mid-rangers. I've had the Pixels. I've had the flagships. I've had all of them, even going back to the Nexus days. So I could tell you, it's always going to be a good experience. That little nuance might be, you know, undesirable, but it's not make or break in my opinion. Now, where I think things for the Google Pixel 5a become troublesome is the fact that one of its key features, which is its camera and its video recording, I believe it's the high resolution video recording in the 60 frames setting. So the 4K 60 frames. That is a very taxing and demanding task. That feature in and of itself oftentimes requires the spec sheet on a phone to be pushed to the maximum, meaning flagship processor, flagship RAM quantity, if they would call it that. So 6 gigs of RAM is like bare minimum. 8's probably better. 10 and 12, we've seen that with Galaxies and OnePlus devices. They throw tons of RAM at phones, and the processors are flagships. That's where things get tough for this phone, and I've said it in previous videos, and in reference to flagship phones and their video rendering, editing, and all that. It can be a tough task to do. Now here's the thing, Josh, you said 2017 phones did 4K 60. Flagship 2017 phones did. This is still not the processor to really do it properly. So while the 5A does do it, it's got like a 10-minute max, and then it overheats, and it gives you like a heat warning. So it can do it, but it can't do it right. I think what's going to end up happening, and Google would be wise to do this, is send some sort of a firmware software update to the phone to help it achieve that task a little bit more effectively. Even if it means you have to kind of slightly tune down the processing power, as long as it doesn't affect the functionality too much. Because there's a lot of good about this phone, and hopefully that doesn't deter people from buying it. Because think about it. It's got a decent processor. It's got a great camera. The video is much improved from what I understand. You're going to get the best software experience. You're going to get long-term support. It's got a very large battery relative to Google phones. There's a lot going for this device. That really seems to be the fatal flaw, though. If somebody's recording in 4K 60 frames, they're going to have trouble. So, I don't mean to rain on the parade of the 5A. It's definitely not perfect, and it's definitely not flagship, and it was not designed to be. Maybe that means you have to temper your expectations, or maybe that means you have to stay away from the phone. It's not for you if you're a flagship kind of person. That's your call. Remain objective, I think, is the best approach.